if it's going to take an hour, are you really giving them the key points that they need to know from our policies? Probably not. And they're just getting extra information. And we all know we get tired by the end of the shift or beginning of the shift. We're not even awake.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal: to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
Hey there, Sterile Processing Universe. My name's Hank Balch. You're listening to Season 26 of the Beyond Clean podcast, the processes that saved lives. In today's episode, we're going to be talking to Anna Gutierrez, the Sterile Processing Educator Lead at Texas Children's Hospital, and on the topic of washer loading for the win, the nuances of loading these equipment that they're terrific, but they're not magic boxes. So if we load them wrong, we don't get the output that we want. So we're going to dive into what that looks like from the training side, from the misconception side, and we're going to dive into some topics around how to partner well with your vendor. So hang here with us. We'll be right back in studio with Anna Gutierrez.
I'm Bobby Parker.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
All right, clean freaks, we are in studio today for this episode on washer loading for the win in sterile processing. And this is a name that you've heard. It's a voice that you may find familiar on the Beyond Clean Network. Anna Gutierrez is joining us from Texas Children's Hospital. In that role, she is the Sterile Processing Educator Lead out there making a difference in hospitals all across the state of Texas, and educating and precepting and improving the processes. And today I got her on the hook to talk to us about this washer loading question. I told her right before we got recording here, this is one of the episodes. It's really near and dear to my heart. I mean, I love everything we talk about, but I really like this topic. So Anna, thank you for joining us back on the show today.
You're welcome.
So just in case folks are new to you, I know I kind of alluded, like you've been on a handful of our seminars through the years. Obviously, you're a member of the Beyond Clean Advisory Group. And I know we've spoken together at least once, maybe a couple of different times in live sessions out there across the country. But any background that you like to share, any like how'd you get into SPD kinds of things before we get into the meat of the interview today?
Yeah, so something that I I started adding to some of my bios recently is I used to be elementary school teacher. And so
I did not know that.
Yeah, not a lot of people know that. And I felt like it started to get important because I started getting lots of questions. But I started as an elementary teacher, and I found out I didn't quite like other people's children so much. But
that's a thing.
I love the teaching aspect. And then some of you guys might think I'm working at a children's hospital. I love kids and I highly advocate. And I think that's the hard part for me is I'm very clingy to that aspect of making sure our kids are safe. And that doesn't very much happen all the time. And so I got away from that. But education is super close to my heart. And then the quality aspect of it and just advocating for our SPD spaces kind of goes hand in hand with everything that I do. That's kind of how I got into SPD a little bit, aside from my personal story that some of you may know. It's a big part. The education piece is a big part of why I do what I do and why I'm in this role.
It's interesting that you bring that up. Obviously, I've known you for a number of years, and I can see it now. I can see that elementary school teacher in you as well. Just the spirit, the excitement that you bring to the kinds of topics and the content and the education. I think, that's key, obviously, for keeping the attention of the younger crowd out there. But I think it's also important when you're educating adults as well, in some sense. And
yeah.
As you alluded to, you get to advocate for children in different ways in both of those roles. So I think that's a cool intro story for sure. As we get into the topic here, this is one of those things that huge part of the sterile processing workflow. Automated cleaning is critical today. It's one of the awesome advents of technology that has happened in the past maybe 30, 40 years, maybe even longer than that, right? But it's really coming to the entire workflow in many places is built around these automated washers these days. And yet, this topic we're going to dive in today, the loading protocol, is so easily missed in our training, or it's just ignored in the daily practice. And I see this from the consulting side of things when I'm out there actually auditing and observing departments and just what people are actually doing in this loading process. Why is it such a big deal, number one, if we get this wrong? And why do you think it's so systemically, there's so many gaps still out there today?
I think one of the most common things that we run into is it's simply like the easiest answer that we can ever give is SPD is just a high pressure environment in general. We rush to try to accomplish everything that we possibly can within a shift. We're short-staffed. We're undereducated in some of those areas, just lack of information sometimes. And sometimes the hospitals just grow to be excessively larger than what was intended for the space. And just all of those constraints in general, those are easy answers to give. I think when we take a look at the deeper dives, there's always a solution to everything if we really want to find a solution and implement it. And so when we really take a look at those things is how are we training from day one? And even at the college level, how are we training our technicians to really understand the concepts, not just the hand movements and the walking in the department and making sure that we're loading things into the cart washer, because we teach hand washing pretty well. But when it comes to the cart washers, there's so many small, intricate pieces to it that we don't elaborate on. And I think that's the part that we miss.
Right. And yeah, the myth of the magic box is at play in your answer, right? Because it's almost like if we miss the education piece of the why behind what it is we're doing. Like you mentioned, it's not just the movements. It's like, what are these movements doing? And then what's the equipment doing, once we do this? But yeah, if we miss that piece, it's very easy for that kind of myth to grow up in maybe even the subconsciousness of the technician to think, well, if I'm putting it in there and I'm following all the practices or the steps maybe that I think I should to get into the box, but then once it's in this magic box, then it's going to do its magic and it's going to come out the other side the way that it is. But as you're saying, number one, that's not true. But number two, if you don't understand the why behind the training to get you to that stage, it's very easy to make the kinds of shortcuts or, forget under the pressure and the time constraints that you're just alluding to. So as an educator, I want to go back maybe here to your answer. If one of the challenges are these pressures and constraints, obviously educators feel the same pressures and constraints to get these technicians trained, to get them competencied on an annual or biannual basis or quarterly basis, whatever your schedule is. Do you see that as another one of these potential gaps? And if so, how do we counteract that with, and you know better than I do, the mountain of things that you have to train in competency in sterile processing? This washer loader is like critical, but it's just one of the hundreds of things that you're going to have to be training on. How do we find that balance?
Yeah. So I want to kind of touch on some aspects of educators. I love our reps.
Okay.
Like educators allowing our vendor reps or vendor partners to come in and simply blanket statement the solution to training on the washers and the washer disinfectors in general. And it's great. It's great. But some of the things that I want to do and kind of put an emphasis on is their vendor partners that we're working with. I partner specifically with my vendors. My vendors are not allowed to present to my staff unless I'm with them and unless we've vetted the information together, because our vendors don't particularly know the policies and all the small intricate details, the type of cycles that we have that biomed plugged into these. They need to be aware of that if we want them to do a good job educating our team too. And so I partner specifically with them. And I think that's one of the bigger gaps that I see is our time constraints as an educator. Yes, it's very limited. I feel the burden. I feel the impact of every time that my team messes up. It's almost like it's on me because I didn't do a good job at training them. And the reality is that I may have missed one or two persons on their learning level, their learning needs, their assessments that I needed to double back on. And I think I try not to take it too hard, but it is, that one or two persons on my team that really need to have focused education on. That's going to be another key part to it. But going back to the vendors, partner with them, make sure that you're not missing the opportunity to really partner with them and build the education together to make it effective for your team and for your facility. I think that's a big one.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is such a tremendous, deep takeaway here. And I'm trying to think through all the implications, even as you're laying this out here. But you're absolutely right. If you look at it if you have multiple vendors coming in with all their own unique perspectives and their own unique nuances, and, to your other point, like some assumptions and maybe even misconceptions on their part, because as you said, many of them haven't worked directly in sterile processing, and you're not vetting that as an educator or as a manager. And even worse, you brought this up, if you're not present to hear that conversation as it's being delivered to your staff, wow. I mean, so many different practices and again, like different protocols could be introduced into your department by a simple in-service that you feel like as an educator or a manager, you're like, hey, this is good. I'm bringing in Susie and she's going to in-service on the washers and it's going to be great. It's going to be second shift. So I'm going to leave and I'm just going to let y'all do your thing. Let me know how it goes tomorrow. And it's just like when you ask your kids when they come home from school, it's like, hey, what'd you learn in school? Well, they're going to tell you a couple things. They're not going to tell you everything.
Yeah.
And they're not going to tell you the things necessarily that they learned that you're like, well, yeah, I don't know if I agree with that part or whatever. Same thing, with our staff is we're feeding them. If we're not vetting these reps, like you mentioned, we're kind of allowing all these different voices to go in. That's not necessarily the way that we want things done in our SPD. I think that's, man. That's deep.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about this.
I've
not heard a lot of people talk about that.
Yeah. It happened one time and never again. And it wasn't, honestly, I was pressed on time. I couldn't be at the facility when I really wanted to because we had another fire going on and it just happens. But as an educator, like I have to be very literal about what I allow present to my staff and making sure that they have the highlights, right? The key points, because we only have 15, 30 minutes maybe to present these things. And, if it's going to take an hour, are you really giving them the key points that they need to know from our policies? Probably not. And they're just getting extra information. And we all know we get tired by the end of the shift or beginning of the shift. We're not even awake.
Right. Yeah, especially doing those in-services in the morning to catch third shift and first shift. And like third shift is like, guys, I just worked all night. I want to go home and you're going to hold me here for another half an hour, another hour. Like you really got to be strategic about that information to your point. But man, I would love to hear anyone that's, listening to this that has done what Anna just mentioned, which is create this vetting protocol with your vendor partners. Like, that is going to take time. It's going to take extra time. It's going to take extra work to get your fingers on the pulse of that. And then to also, not that you're controlling the message, but you're ensuring the message is standardized and specific to your facility, I think, is the big takeaway. Well, I can't get off track. I want to talk about that like the whole rest of the episode, but I'm like, no, we got to get through this topic. But man, you got me thinking on that, on that piece, because it's so easy to feel like, oh, these vendor partners know so much. Many of them are true subject matter experts in their niche, but not necessarily how it connects to the rest of our workflow. And specifically to the staff, you mentioned the individuals who have specific gaps and needs in their competencies that you as an educator understand, and then you can add that additional training or help. But okay, anyways, I'm going back into it. Okay, back to our topic. Before we get into loading the actual washer, let's talk about loading and prepping our instruments and trays that are going to go into and be loaded in that washer. So what do we need to know about the tray prep and loading stage that then we're going to talk about how to properly load those into these washer disinfectors?
Yeah. So the very, very first step is making sure that the testing and that your washer arms are appropriately working. That's absolutely the first step. So I'm not going to get into like the actual testing and learning that kind of stuff, but every technician, I have a rule that I live by. Rule number 1 is you don't trust anyone. And that means that you simply have to be diligent and make sure that the testing was actually performed and that it actually passed. And so making sure that you're checking your records before you even get started, and then making sure that the washer arms were also checked or cleaned out at the beginning of your shift, that there's no debris at the bottom of your chambers. And so that's step number 1. Step number 2 is absolutely going to be pre-cleaning and sorting and making sure that you take the time at the sink to follow that process, whatever that process is in your hospital. When you're loading into the into the washers, you then want to make sure that everything is in the open position. Some hospitals have very specific processes or protocols on how the instrument should be laid out. If you have a double decker or a triple decker, what does that look like? Some hospitals are just very, precise in the way that they determine how it's going to be arranged on the washer shelves themselves. And so make sure that you're following those protocols. But generally speaking, you should have things at the bottom that are a bit heavier and then your lighter items at the top, just to make sure that everything's arranged correctly. But if the items are not clean by the time that they arrive into that washer, then you're already skipping a step. You need to make sure that at the sink, you performed the pre-cleaning that should have happened. The majority of bone debris that was still stuck, you removed your enzymatic detergent if your enzymatic detergent has to be washed off. I understand some manufacturers state that you no longer have to rinse it, but you still have to go through the first sink. And so you have to follow those processes, even when the manufacturer is giving you different instructions, because that's just the correct process to take.
So you mentioned step number 1 is obviously the testing or the verification that the test has been done. I'm going to ask a very obvious question. Why is that important?
You want to make sure that your machine is running to the standard that you need it to run. That if there was anything left on the instrument, that the pressure and the rotation of the arms, and that there's actually enough water coming out of to create the pressure, that all of those things are functioning inside of your washer. If you end up testing your washer and you still notice that there's a bit of red, whatever test you're using, yes. If you see that there is anything questionable on your test results, then your machine is not actively working correctly. That's your opportunity to say, hey, let's go ahead and call Biomed And that's your opportunity to communicate to the OR, to your leaders, so that they're aware we're either going to have to slow down or we're going to have to get biomed involved pretty quickly.
One part about this washer loading training question is, how is it different, or is it different when we're dealing with delicate and small instruments? What process or what approach would you encourage folks to think through if they're going to load something that's more delicate?
Yeah, I think definitely learning how to basically handle them. There's so many intricate pieces to some of those smaller pieces. They bend easily. They get caught within things. And then when you're loading them into the washer, it just makes it sometimes impossible to appropriately load them and still keep, I guess, the idea of how do I keep these instruments safe, but still clean them. And one of the things that we got to keep in mind is just sometimes thinking outside the box, like how do we protect these instruments? Sometimes some of the things that some of my technicians have done is adding a protective like basket over it so that they don't get out of the container or the basket as it's washing.
Like you lock them in there like they're in jail,
yeah.
Right?
There's special baskets that you can purchase sometimes. We try to keep those in areas or departments where we know we're going to have those delicate instruments. And then a lot of those delicate instruments come with a lot of suctions every once in a while. And so knowing how to irrigate them properly, because sometimes they just haven't invented the size brush sometimes. But definitely knowing to use your brushes if you have the capability of using brushes, but then using your flushing systems if you have any to irrigate them without causing extra wear and tear because you're adding the wrong size or the wrong amount of pressure in those cannulas because they're so small. So that is important. We see a lot of breaks in those more delicate cannulas when we simply just don't know how much pressure or PSI to apply to the flushing of those cannulas. So those are just some concepts.
So you mentioned the flushing piece, and I don't think that we've mentioned this before, but I know there's some manifolds out there on the market, like the washer manifolds that have that kind of irrigation and like, hookup, like kind of like what you would see in the ultrasonic cleaner. But then these are for the washers. And so if it's like laparoscopic devices or like if you're doing robotic arms, for instance, you gotta hook it up, right? The flushing irrigation ain't working if it ain't hooked up. It's not the magic box scenario. So, to your point, you got to make sure, number one, that this device is validated for the pressure that's coming through that flushing. But then number two, it's got to be properly connected. I would assume it's probably a good practice if you're washing the delicate items to check the drain screen after the load, just in case, right?
Yes. We actually ran into something really peculiar the other day where we had a device that's naturally embedded in the washer and that kind of fell through the drain. But just to kind of see the impact, it melted that piece. And so it's a pretty sturdy plastic piece that's already found in the washer, but it fell through the drain. And so just identifying like what are some items that is it a good idea to even add these into my washers, right? Knowing the concepts. And then again, to your point, Hank, do you add simply because you have the availability of having those manifolds and the connections? Should I add some of my cannulas and apply that amount of pressure? We don't realize it, but those washers are pretty powerful and they get pretty hot very quickly, sometimes upwards of 200 and X degrees. Is that safe for the type of metal that you're working with? So just making sure that you're applying that, because once you apply heat, that's a chemical reaction that's happening inside of that washer, and that's irreversible. And then you send it to your physician and it handles differently at that point without you even realizing, and they don't understand why. So understanding those concepts, but all of those pieces are important in making sure that you're using the manifolds correctly, your washers correctly, how the washer works in particular, and that you're setting the right cycle.
Well, speaking of cannulas and delicate items and different plastics, let's talk vendor trays here. So, something that gets loaded all the time in washers are vendor trays. Man, they come in all different shapes and sizes from all different kinds of manufacturers. And there's all different kinds of instrumentation inside of them. So how do you approach, educating around compliantly loading those trays, that we're not skipping steps and we're not taking unnecessary risks just to get things through the washer quicker?
Yeah, I think it's important. I think communication is key. I think one of the biggest pain points that a department might have is, the best trained technician, knowing that he should separate the set because it's a double, triple decker, has separated this set. And it came with multiple loaner trays, and now you don't know how to put it back together. And it's 3 a.m. and they need them by 7. Solely the communication part is going to be key, making sure that someone else is involved in knowing what goes together, how it goes together, and that the vendor has appropriately communicated what the set name is, and that he used the same name convention for sterile processing and for the operating room, and that they understand what is being wrapped and what is inside of the wrapped, terminally ready, prepared tray. Because sometimes the way that they turn it in doesn't necessarily mean that that's what it's going to look like at the end, because they brought it into a rigid container. We might wrap it because of the weight limits that we have to stick to. And so communication is key. But then again, knowing that you have some loaner instruments that are going to have implants. How am I safely going to reprocess these? Do I go ahead and separate them? Do I go ahead and, set the screw caddy separately? How do I make sure that the screw caddy is clean? Like, you got to think outside of the box. And, do I add a basket on top? Do I have something that can protect those screws? Or maybe I hand wash them and then put them in there, close the screw caddy at that point, because technically they shouldn't have been touched prior.
Right.
But we want to be safe, right? So thinking outside the box and just helping the department make sense of the process that you're going to apply to those loaners, and having a game plan of, when we have loaners in, this is our process. This is how they're going to look. We're going to put one tray on the left side, top, middle, bottom. And then the second tray is going to be top, middle, bottom, and they're labeled.
Right, that standard loading diagram, maybe, yes. Yeah.
Because if one technician gets away from that plan, then nobody knows how to put that set together. That's important.
Yeah, it's a really interesting call out there, too, because these trays, because they have multiple levels many times, and they don't have our barcode, if they're not an owned item, so they're almost invisible. They can become invisible in the process. And because they're not our owned item, they're the least likely tray that we can just tell by looking at it what goes together. So there's like a level of competency that many times we just hadn't arrived at because we don't know this tray. And all of that process that you're kind of outlining there of, hey, the standard loading protocol is what's going to keep this device together compliantly and effectively every time it's coming through the washer, so that everybody knows on the clean side how this thing goes back together. And I know there's different ways that folks have gone about, trying to keep that together, like different color coding, tagging systems. I've heard like poker chips, but, make sure that there's some kind of validated material in that. Back to your earlier point about plastic melting and whatnot. So you got to make sure that you're not adding more issues trying to solve the tracking issue. But really important nuances. I'll throw out, one more, not to get us off track, but if you got implants, try to keep that outside of that lubrication cycle, because lubricant and implants should not be going together. So you got to be thinking about that as you're loading as well, and which cycle you're selecting. Before we wrap, though, I want to talk to you about vendor education real quick, because I know you've got an opinion on this I think is really important for folks to hear out here. If you've got a vendor, let's say it's a loaner tray vendor, or maybe it's like a washer vendor or a chemical vendor, anybody that touches this process that we're talking about, is it okay to just be like, hey, your in-service is at 3:00. make sure to go in there and give your in-service, and I'm going to be in the break room, taking my 15-minute break. Is that a good process for an educator out there today?
No, and it's such a touchy subject for me because rule number 1 in my books, you don't trust anyone. And it's not because I'm being ugly or mean. It's simply you're completing your due diligence and making sure that 1, your policy within your hospital system is being followed, but 2, that it makes sense to what they're training to at your facility. Because a lot of times that may not happen, and it's not the vendor's fault. The way that I see it is, if I have a vendor come in, they're my vendor partner. And so I partner with them to help solidify the education for my team. And so that means that, I'm asking my vendor, hey, how are you going to present this? Basically present the in-service to me, and I'm going to work with you to kind of tweak it and make sure that it makes sense to my staff, because we have this policy that's outlined for us. And whatever you're teaching to, we have to make sure that our policy applies to what you're teaching to. I had the misfortune of, again, trusting one vendor, and he taught it to the T from what he was spec'd out in his IFU. And it just did not collaborate with our policy. And so by the time I went back to our facility, because I couldn't make it that day to one of our community hospitals, my staff was just so confused. They had called me several times and they were wondering, well, you taught us, but the vendor said, what are we supposed to do? And again, never again will that happen. I partner with my vendor partners, and I make sure that the education makes sense and that they're vetted and that they're approved and that everyone knows we're on the same page and this is how it's going to be educated.
I think many of us have had that scenario, either like on the tech perspective side or as a department leader, standing there, seeing a vendor giving that in-service. You're like, oh, no, don't tell them that. Don't tell them that. That's not what we do, or that's not compliant or consistent. Yeah. And, we've also seen the other side of the spectrum too, which you will catch if you're vetting them the way that you're saying. But we've seen vendors like say, just, wash it the way that you wash everything else, right? Just like however you usually do it, that's what you need to do. And you're like, no, that's also not giving us the information that we need. So I think that's a great way to kind of tie up everything that we've talked about in this episode, Anna, is it's got to be concise, standard, compliant, consistent. And the only way that you're going to do that is if you're involved at the leadership, at the education, and even at the technician level. And I always try to tell technicians when I'm talking to them one-on-one, you may not have the educator title or the manager title, but you have everything to do with the education of your team members and with the leadership of what's going on in your circle, in your shift, in your facility. You don't need the title to be a leader, and you don't need the title to be an educator. And we've got to work together to make sure that these things we've been talking about, loading and unloading these washers, happens compliantly every time, especially when the educator and the manager are not around to see.
Mm-hmm. Especially, yes.
All right, Anna. Hey, thank you. Great conversation today. Really appreciate you joining us on the Beyond Clean podcast.
Thank you, Hank. It's always a pleasure being here.
All right. That was Anna Gutierrez. You're listening to season 26 of the Beyond Clean podcast, the processes that save lives. Just like we remind you each and every week here at Beyond Clean, thank you for tuning in. And until we talk to you next week, keep fighting dirty.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app, or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for Beyond Clean in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We look forward to hearing from you.